If we have further questions, the microphone will come to you. The lady there at the back. Hello.
Thank you. Anu Bradford from Columbia Law School. So when we talk about regional economic integration, I would like to hear your comments on the parallel efforts to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and how that impacts the ASEAN countries that are not participating in those negotiations.
John, do you have a thought on that?
You know, I think these blocs are going to take place, you know, in a world that has a series of bilateral and multilateral trade agreements, and I don't see the success or failure of TPP directly related to the work that's done in the ASEAN region. You know, Pak Gita is more equipped to deal with this question than I am, but I think that the world is beginning to recognize at one level the benefits of free trade and understand the reason for doing it. And politics aside, I think more of it's gonna happen.
Do you think that there are too many of these organizations?
Well, I think there's a lot of them. I think the bigger question is, you know, and whether you talk about TPP in the context of the Japanese farmers and whether they want in or out, I don't think we've done a good enough job helping the person on the street 10 miles from Yangon to understand why this is important to them. They tend to either not understand it or see it as a threat. And that's true in countries like the United States too. And until we can explain that to the average person who tends to see their standard of living change in the terms of a light switch, the ability to educate their kids, basic forms of health care, if they don't see differences in those areas, then you can talk all you want about TPP and ASEAN trade and the EU. It doesn't work.
Okay, Kishore?
I mentioned geopolitical competition. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the number one geopolitical contest is going to be between the United States and China. Now, they could have gone the way of the Soviet Union and United States and had a competitive military race. The good news is that they're now competing in the area of trade liberalization. So United States is pushing TPP, China is pushing RCEP, and by the way, if both succeed, the region benefits enormously. And what's striking is that the Chinese are actually thinking of joining the TPP. And the fact that they're thinking in that direction, I mean, basically, the Chinese say yes to TPP. Washington is going to get very frightened, as you know. But nonetheless, it's a positive development. So this is an example of how geopolitical competition in trade will lead to positive results.
Minister?
There are 4 countries that have decided to join the TPP. Those are Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia and Singapore. And that's not to say that the other ASEAN countries are not thinking about it. And I think the party line from Indonesia has been that we're just not at a point to be able to ascertain as to whether or not this would be net beneficial to us. Look, we're engaged in bilaterals and plurilaterals and regionals, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to be open-minded about some of the more plurilateral or even multilateral. And that's really not just the spirit with which we look at TPP, but that's the spirit with which we look at the WTO, the multilateralism. And I think the risk is a fewfold. But you know, with the economy around the world going the way it is, as we're seeing, there may be a slowdown in the process of the discussions. And I think you've just got to be realistic about the aspirations. Now, if I take a look at the TPP just at a glance, it just seems a little more 22nd century than I thought it would be. Whereas if I take a look at the RCEP, it seems a little 20th century. So I think both sides need to recalibrate, but there is no reason for the two not to converge at some point.
Thank you. Minister, we have one more question over here.
Thank you. Andrew Thomas of the Ogilvy Group. I remember in 1991 asking a businessman talking about the integration of Europe, what the significant benefit would be. And the most tangible thing that anybody could come up with was the fact that electricity sockets across Europe would all be the same. And that didn't happen. So that I can be an ambassador for ASEAN integration, It's 2015, and because you're here on this panel, you have one wish to champion over the next 12 years. What would it be that you would want of ASEAN for your business, for governments, as policy shapers in 2025? Sorry.
2025, Jaspal, I suspect you might still be at Standard Chartered that time.
Well, I think technology is going to play a very big part. But besides technology, I think what we can do is really set up the infrastructure. And I'm not talking physical infrastructure. This is the institutional infrastructure. It's uneven today, but I think there's lots of room. And I think if we can have a common financial infrastructure from a very selfish point of view, I think that singly will not just enable the financial services, but then trade and then the leverage on already a very good story independently by country to be leveraged up substantially.
John?
I'd say you want another point of GDP growth that benefits all the citizens in the region. I think if you don't get that out of this, then why do it? If you're not going to enhance growth and an improving standard of living for everybody in the region, why do it?
Minister, I'm going to tweak Andrew Thomas's question slightly and say, once you're president of Indonesia, what will you do by the end of your second term?
That's a setup. Let me speak as the Minister of Trade. By the year 2025, I don't aspire differently from what John has just articulated. I think what will keep ASEAN alive and together, the way Kishore would have described it, in terms of its geopolitical construct and also its economic construct, is that we've got to make sure that everybody gets a share. And that's really economic growth with equity. We're dealing with that issue in Indonesia. People in Sabang don't make as much as people in Merauke. People in Jakarta don't make as much as those outside Jakarta. And we've got to make sure that there's a good understanding of what's happening not only within Indonesia, but outside Indonesia. Now, I don't want to dramatize this, but it's not just the Indonesians and the ASEAN people that don't get it about free trade, that don't get it about the multilaterals and all that. You know, a good friend from the US had told me that they did a polls, you know, in some parts of the US that, you know, there are more people in the US who believe in the UFO than they do in free trade. So it's not just us. It's even in more developed economies that they don't have a good enough understanding of what needs to be understood. So I think what needs to happen with ASEAN is that we've got to make sure that the growth is there, but the distribution and equity of welfare is also there.
Kishore, and again, I'll tweak that question slightly. If ASEAN is already a miracle, how many more miracles can you hope for by 2025?
Well, there's a lot more work to be done in this region. I mean, clearly there are disparities and all that. So, but I mention one concrete wish, okay? You know, as you know, ASEAN has agreed to have an open skies agreement by 2015. And if that is fully implemented, and you find, you know, budget airlines going from a small town in Indonesia to a small town in Laos or Myanmar and all that, it's going to again change the chemistry of the region even more. And one significant thing has happened in ASEAN that nobody has ever mentioned so far. It's hard to document. But you know, as a result of budget airlines growing in Southeast Asia, poor Southeast Asian artists have begun to travel to other countries. And guess what? There's a lot of dialogue and communication going on among poor artists in Southeast Asia, which, by the way, hasn't been fully documented yet. I've got all kinds of anecdotal evidence, but that's going to grow, and that'll be another miracle.
With respect, but what role will poor artists have in the development of ASEAN?
It's enormous. I mean, you must remember that we all don't live for bread alone. We just don't live for money alone. But if you can see a Southeast Asian cultural renaissance coming as a result of Southeast Asian artists working together across different traditions, that's going to be a miracle.
Serge, your wish list for 2025, I see you've brought a whole book of things that you think need to be done.
Well, to be honest, I find it a bit difficult to answer this question because, you know, Southeast Asia or ASEAN as a whole, where it will be depends so much on, for instance, leaders of ASEAN, who the leaders would be. And these are factors that are way beyond my control or even expectation. So I really don't know what to say. I only know that I hope by 2025 I don't have to be speaking at any forums and just go play golf.
I think the minister might like to join you.